All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. If you've been tracking regional security, you already know the immediate market shockwaves caused by the 2026 Strait of Hormuz closure. But today, we aren't just going over the disruption itself. We're going to map out the permanent strategic shifts and the massive systemic reconfigurations that followed.
Here's our roadmap for this briefing. 1. The February maritime catalyst. 2. Immediate supply chain triage. 3. May realignments and power shifts. 4. Mid-year treaty deadlines. And finally, 5. The future continental infrastructure matrix.
Kicking things off with Part 1, the February maritime catalyst. A baseline completely shattered. This is where decades of maritime security assumptions effectively vanished overnight.
It's really fascinating to see this chronological sequence laid out, anchoring ourselves from the February blockade right through to those impending pipeline treaty expiries in July. You can see exactly how acute panic evolved into permanent, locked-in policy shifts. Now, the crucial point here is the sheer contrast between the two systems. Bypassing the strait isn't just a matter of turning a new valve. You are trading highly vulnerable maritime chokepoints, littered with mines, for incredibly complex engineering hurdles and really high political sovereignty friction on land.
Let's look at the actual math. This equation defines the raw supply deficit, and it makes the baseline crisis starkly clear. We take the 20 million barrels per day that flowed through Hormuz during peacetime, and we subtract the emergency pipeline capacity from both the Saudi Petroline and the UAE's ACDOP pipeline. When you plug in those 2026 numbers, the result is an absolutely staggering mathematical proof, a 13.2 million barrel per day deficit. It's wild to realize that even operating at maximum emergency throughput, existing overland lines only mitigated about a third of the lost maritime volume. That single number is the driving force behind literally everything that happens next.
Which brings us to Part 2, immediate supply chain triage, from February to April. This mathematical reality forced the entire region into a desperate scramble just to survive the bottleneck.
Notice the extreme economic disparity here. It's just massive. Kuwait suffered an 88% production collapse simply because they lacked bypasses. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia's existing infrastructure actually kept its GDP growing at a projected 1.9%. It's a perfect demonstration of how overland infrastructure directly dictates a nation's economic survival. So, Saudi Arabia maximized its petroline, pushing 7 million barrels a day to the Red Sea to maintain its industrial base. But, and this is a huge but, April drone strikes proved that even terrestrial pipelines have localized security vulnerabilities. Those strikes temporarily knocked out 3 million barrels of capacity right when they needed it most. To survive, Kuwait had to get incredibly creative. They initiated this complex regional integration model to utilize Saudi and Emirati pipes. This meant ironing out strict blending specs, verifying compression headroom, and simultaneously negotiating a massive 30 to 60-day storage buffer down in neutral Oman. If you look at this data matrix, showing the sheer drop in national baselines between February and May, it underscores exactly who had the infrastructure to weather the storm. While Saudi Arabia and the UAE shifted gears, completely landlocked exporters, like Qatar, faced near total export halts for their liquid hydrocarbons. Moving right along to Part 3, May realignments and power shifts, bidding for independence. Here is where the prolonged crisis sparked monumental geopolitical shifts. The UAE literally tore up the playbook. They pivoted hard toward a zero-dependency policy, exiting OPEC in May to completely unshackle their production. By fast-tracking their new West-East pipeline for 2027, Abu Dhabi transformed overnight from a consensus-driven partner into a highly independent energy actor. However, there is a really fascinating structural paradox here. Yes, the crude is successfully moving over land and finding freedom, but the UAE's expanding LNG sector is still physically trapped inside the maritime chokepoints of the Arabian Gulf. So full independence is achievable for liquids, but it's a much harder reality for gas. Tracking forward into May and June, you can see how this all builds. We hit the May 14th launch of the Sharjah-Oman land corridor, and interestingly, even with the preliminary U.S.-Iran agreement in June promising some maritime relief, the pivot to land logistics was already permanently locked in. Oman really emerged as the ultimate secure logistics gateway here. By leaning heavily into its strict political neutrality, it built deep, trusted commercial ties to safely bypass those maritime choke points for critical food and industrial goods. That brings us to Part 4,
mid-year treaty and transit deadlines for July 2026. As the initial panic started to subside, the focus sharply shifted to these looming expirations. Because look, when you rely on overland pipes, you are entirely at the mercy of the sovereign nations they cross. A major friction point is the July expiration of the 1973 Iraq-Turkey pipeline treaty. Ankara absolutely refuses to extend it without major concessions, which triggers intense arbitration and perfectly illustrates how land routes just trade maritime vulnerability for massive geopolitical leverage. Facing this, Baghdad is scrambling. They're fast-tracking the Basra Haditha pipeline with Chinese funding and stress-testing bypasses around KRG territory. And get this, they are literally running a pipeline on wheels, a 250,000-barrel-a-day emergency truck convoy through Syria just to keep federal revenue flowing. Finally, Part 5, the future continental infrastructure matrix for 2027 and beyond. This is where we analyze the permanent setup taking shape. We're witnessing a fierce rivalry unfold here. On one side, you have the growing Levant Axis, using a Gulf-Israel land bridge that cuts transit to just 4 days, alongside a massive Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline. On the other side, you have Egypt's desperate countermoves like Suez tariff discounts to protect its traditional revenues. Take a look at this comprehensive matrix. It outlines the operational capacities of these leading corridor projects. The sheer volume of capital migration flowing into these specific pipes is staggering, permanently redrawing the region's geopolitical map for years to come. But it's not all smooth sailing. Even ambitious megaprojects like IMEC remain paused. They're hindered by massive bottlenecks like a critical 300-kilometer rail gap in Saudi Arabia, capacity limits at Haifa port, and of course, strict political preconditions regarding Palestinian statehood. So, what does this all mean for us going forward? As Middle Eastern logistics permanently transition away from the sea and into a land-based matrix, will overland logistical resilience become the ultimate determinant of global geopolitical power? The data strongly points to yes. The nations controlling these terrestrial corridors literally hold the keys to the future. I hope this explainer has equipped you with a sharper lens to view these structural shifts. Keep analyzing the data, and I'll catch you in the next briefing.